What's up, guys? It's Q&A time. It is June 20th, 2018. This week, Q&A was on training programming, adapting to biofeedback, just learning how to make proper changes to your training program when it's needed. So that is the topic. Had Instagram and Facebook this week, so I will start on the Facebook thread. All right. So in prep, how do you discern training overreaching and simply being exhausted? Would you modulate the RPE in volume if it was simply a case of being tired going in? Well, that's a really good question because obviously the two are going to overlap quite a bit at some point. Where that happens is really dependent on the person, dependent on the prep, dependent on a lot of factors. But yeah, I mean, inevitably there's going to be a point for a lot of people where you're just going in tired. It's not necessarily an indication that you're overreaching on training. I mean, you are overreaching. You're overtrained by the end of a prep anyhow. Your nervous system is probably beat down. Everything systemically is stressed to some extent, more so than usual. And that's just kind of part of it at that point. So what I would typically look at is strength. So when somebody starts noticing pretty marked strength loss, then I know that they're kind of hitting that point. So, just for example, maybe it's 3 weeks out, 4 weeks out, or whatever. I'm probably going to reduce the amount of CNS taxing movements. I obviously still want to maintain strength. I don't want their strength to go to nothing, but I might reduce the amount of movements. So for example, we'll say their leg training, they were doing heavy squats, heavy RDLs, heavy leg presses, all in the same session. So now maybe I might move it back to one of those movements, maintaining a certain weight set point at least, or trying to, and then fill the volume with submaximal work, whether it's like a giant sets or just submaximal straight sets in general, whatever technique I'm using. So yeah, I would probably mostly look at strength at that point and kind of determine it that way. Okay, at a bare minimum, what might your recommendation be for volume and frequency? And what intensity principles might you incorporate to make the best use of time? This is within the context of trying to make progress in general, fat loss, gain strength, or maybe in extreme situation, contest prep on a budgeted time. So it sounds like they're asking, this person, let's say somebody's in kind of a time crunch. There is a such thing, the MEV, minimum effective volume, or minimum effective dose, or whatever you want to call it. And with that said, I mean, we've seen plenty of people over the years that have progressed on extremely low volume, under what you would consider minimum effective volume. So if it's a schedule situation, then, you have to work with what you have. Granted, you might be under what would be considered MEV technically, but at the same time, I mean, you only have so much time. So if that means that you have to primarily rely on progressive overload through a low volume program, like a DC type program, or something that's using extremely high intensity and lower amount of work sets, then do that. It is what it is at that point. I don't have a minimum effective, a minimum volume that I could give you, because muscle groups are going to be different, people's recovery ability is going to be different, and all those things, and their experience in the gym. MEV is going to be different for somebody that's advanced versus somebody that's novice. But you need to obviously realize that volume is a pretty important marker for hypertrophy, and that's been established, I think, pretty well at this point, especially through some of the newer research. So if you can't exploit that, then yeah, I mean, you need to rely on progressive overload a little bit more, and that's going to mean volume's lower. As far as frequency goes, I don't really think it matters that much. It comes down to recovery. Take your volume, split it up however you want in terms of frequency, whatever allows you to recover best. If you notice that your total number of sets for chest is, whatever the number is, and you are, maybe it's 16 for the week, and you are noticing that your workout's really starting to dwindle at set 10, so work set 10 or work set 12, then split it up. You're going to get 2 sessions of 8 very effective work sets versus 1 session of 10 to 12 moderately effective, and then the rest are kind of lackluster. So that would probably be my recommendation. In terms of frequency, just go by feel. That's really going to be the biggest thing. I don't think that there's anything magic about super high frequency in regards to progress if volume is met. So intensity wise, in general, we're probably going to see slightly less intensity in a higher volume approach. But again, we still have to have sufficient intensity to stimulate hypertrophy. You're not going to get that with 10 reps left in reserve or whatever, so it's not like you just going and petering around in there. So if it is a time crunch and you have to make the most of those work sets, then your intensity is going to be a little bit higher. You can also do things to accumulate volume in a shorter amount of time. So things like rest pause, cluster, any kind of cluster technique, whether it's an EMOM or a muscle round or traditional type cluster sets or whatever, those are a great way to accumulate volume in a shorter amount of time. So I would probably utilize those, to save time and still be able to accumulate the volume with sufficient intensity. Drop sets, you could do anything like that. It's going to accumulate volume in a shorter amount of time. Okay. This next one isn't related to the topic, but I'll go ahead and do it anyhow. I'm not sure if they read the topic, but when did you realize you needed to eat poverty bikini girl macros to get extra lean? Is this something you find very common? I feel as I'm in the same boat, never get so lean because all the metabolic damage talk. Can one become damaged, or is it not an issue as long as it's not long term? Well, I guess the first time I tried to prep, I found out. Every prep's been essentially the same. I end up pretty much in the same spot just about every time, within a couple hundred calories or something. And cardio gets way up there as well. So noticed it when I was competing at 150 pounds or less and 200 pounds, it's with 50 more pounds of muscle. So it doesn't, I wouldn't necessarily say I learned at any specific time other than just when I tried to get lean. It was always like that. So is it common? Metabolic adaptation is common. It happens in pretty much everyone to an extent. How much it happens is just dependent on the person, dependent on the situation. I would say that it happens relatively often. A pretty good amount of metabolic adaptation. The leaner you get, the more it's going to happen. The harder you push, the further you push away from your set point, the more uncomfortable your body gets, the more that adaptation is probably going to occur. So, is it dangerous? There are some dangers, sure. I think that definitely length of time matters. There's going to be a big difference between, like myself, for example, if I have to eat 1,400 calories and do hour and a half, 2 hours of cardio and hit cardio and all that stuff in a prep, there's going to be a big difference between me doing that for 16 weeks straight versus me doing that for the last 6 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever. So, and also what you do after the show is going to make a huge, huge difference. This is why anytime I'm prepping someone, I really have to push them to that place, and I know that those adaptions are occurring, that I really reiterate how important it is to stay with me after the show, get everything back to where it needs to be. It's going to be a slow process. It's going to be a hard process sometimes, and to get everything right back to where it needs to be, get the enough body fat gain, not too much body fat gain, get the hormone adaptions, get everything back in line. So it's not only length of time, but it's also what you do to pull yourself back out of the situation. If you just go back to maintenance or whatever you were at before, you're going to get fat, and it's not going to work because your metabolism is downregulated and your hormones are downregulated and your training, load in the gym is downregulated. So it's a combination of those two things mainly. How soon after before altering variables? I'm not sure what that means. After, before. Do you typically give it days, a week, or 2, or it depends? Okay, so the person asking this does a lot of powerlifting, so it's going to be different for a strength athlete versus a physique athlete, because if I'm working with a strength athlete, I might have a little bit more set template because we are looking at a progression scheme, whether I'm using percentages or whatever. So how often? It's really hard to say. I mean, I've done things where I'm altering variables weekly. But again, whether it's a strength athlete or a physique athlete, if you're progressing and the progression's good, don't touch it. Just don't change too much. So that's generally a good rule of thumb, just because, if it's not broke, don't fix it type thing. So, I would keep that in mind. If you are using a set template, even if you are a strength athlete, that's still gonna be true to an extent. Man, I'm not really able to give a good answer on that, to be completely honest, because I've done different progression schemes with a lot of different people. That's a lousy answer, other than if it's not broke, don't fix it. Okay, Instagram. What are your go-to percentage of 1 rep max or reps in reserve and volume manipulations when transitioning to a deload from an accumulation phase for a natural? Well, first off, I would probably lean more toward reps in reserve or RPE type measurements when I'm looking at a deload. And the reason I say that is because if I'm using a percentage and I lower the percentage, but really it still feels hard for them because they really truly need a deload, they're beat up or whatever, then the person's going to go in the gym and they're still going to hit the weight because that's what's on their template. When in reality, they need to use less weight, or they feel better and maybe they need to use a little bit more. So I would probably lean more towards reps in reserve or RPE scale. If I'm doing a deload, I'm looking at probably like a 6 to 7 RPE max for a lot of people. And that's probably going to be sufficient to rest their CNS and accomplish what we need to in the deload. I would say that's a maximum. And then volume-wise, well, I could do a couple things with it. I've done it so many different ways, to be honest. Like, I've not touched volume at all and just lowered intensity substantially. And I've also lowered volume or lowered amount of training days. If I'm going to lower volume, I'm probably going to maybe lower the day by 20% volume, maybe 25%, but I might chop a day off in the week. If they're training 5 days, I might lower it to 4 or 3 for the week, or start the week, or start the deload phase. Let's say they end their week on a Sunday and they're repeating their next 7-day cycle, which is going to be the deload. I might have them take Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday off entirely. And then only train 3 more days throughout the rest of the week. So I'm probably going to chop their total weekly volume out by cutting days off also, and maybe manipulate their nutrition or whatever accordingly. But just as a general rule of thumb, I'm probably going to lean more towards intensity scale to some extent, or in some way, for measurements here, just because I do want them to go by how they feel and not feel like they have to hit a percentage of a 1 rep max when they walk in there, even if they're really, really beat up. What is the longest and shortest amount of time you will run a client in a contest prep mesocycle, have you ever had a client ditch a program after a week? If so, what was the breaking point as to why they stopped and changed programs? In a contest prep, I've had people run damn near the same training for an entire contest prep in several instances. And the reason is they progressed for a while, kind of plateaued, but they held their strength pretty good up until, maybe the last few weeks or whatever. I didn't see a reason at that point to change that variable. There was no, training was going good. It was maintaining tissue. I mean, muscle growth is not the goal at that point anyhow. So why manipulate that variable? I know that they're probably going in the gym and they're doing the same amount of volume, same amount of intensity. They're maintaining weights pretty good. I know that caloric expenditure is probably pretty similar. I'm just not going to mess with that variable. I'm not going to have to reset them on new movements and where they have to reacclimate to the movement patterns, and they have to reset on their weight progression and all that stuff. So just won't mess with it. Now, there are instances where I would change the training, like what I mentioned on the very first question, in terms of when they're really, really downregulated and beat up. If I have to pull back on all the extreme CNS taxing movements, or for the CNS reasons, or also just to not get hurt. You know what I mean? If they have somebody they just feel so bad that they unrack a squat bar and they see stars and go dizzy, well, I don't really want them dropping in on a 4 or 5 plate squat. It's stupid. They're going to get hurt. So, I've had all different lengths. I would say that in general, though, I'm probably not going to make a ton of changes to training during prep, other than what we initially start with. Maybe a couple things, just like I said, just depends. So, what was the second part of the question? You ever had a client ditch a program after a week? Yeah, but it's probably more like it would have to, things would have to be way off. Maybe they just feel terrible. It's way too much volume, and they didn't recover at all. But even in that case, I might give them 2-3 weeks to try to acclimate to it and see how they respond from there. So it's rare that I would have them ditch it after a week unless something was really, really off. They felt terrible, or all the movements were terrible, or whatever. But whatever the issue is, I can probably do small manipulations to correct it, whether it's changing a movement, whether it's manipulating volume just a little bit, or switching some certain intensity technique or something. I might not have to necessarily completely, just throw the program out the window. But yeah, it has happened. A couple more here, guys. So, when would you begin to target a specific muscle group in a person's programming? Do you prefer to just put tissue on a person before you start targeting specific muscle groups? This is assuming they don't have a ton of tissue, someone in the first few years of training. So I might have a different answer to this than some people. I would say in general, I'm not going to do a ton of prioritizing weak muscle groups in a newer trainee, but there is some exceptions to this. I'd say the main exception is just for structural and muscular imbalances. If they have some big imbalance that I know is going to cause them to probably get injured later on, or they're very uncomfortable, or they're constantly experiencing tightness in tissues or whatever, just because they have some kind of structural imbalance or extreme muscular imbalance, front to back, or their front delts are huge and their chest is really weak, or whatever it is. I might do specific work at that point, more to correct the imbalances and make sure that they don't get hurt, not necessarily because I'm worried about them looking a certain way, because they're going to put tissue on all over. So that would probably be the exception to that rule. But most of the time, assuming there's no huge imbalances, then I'm probably going to keep them on relatively constant volume and constant amount of work for all the muscle groups, and just help, and just grow at that point. Last one. What decides how many movements per session you perform? Should you base it off of volume, sets, per muscle group, etc.? Would love to know your thoughts on the process. Well, I mean, there's a couple things. Equipment availability. Sounds silly, but I mean that's part of it. What feels pretty good? What movements feel pretty good on them. I'm not just gonna reach for a bunch of random shit just to add more movements to it if they are hitting other movements that accomplish the same thing and they're progressing on them. I would say if I'm thinking about a lot of the programming that I do, larger muscle group might have 3 to 4 movements, smaller muscle group might have 2 movements, maybe 1. But I mean, it just depends on how I'm spreading out the frequency and volume for the whole week. But I would say that's probably relatively common. And then obviously volume and the volume is going to really just vary person to person. I'm trying to think of any instances where I have a lot more than that. I might have more than that if somebody is doing a really high, a lot more volume in their training, or we have to do a lot of imbalance specific stuff where we're doing very specific movements outside of their compound movements. So that might be an instance where I do more. But in general, those numbers that I gave, I'd say that's relatively common. And that is it for this week, guys. 22 minutes, right on the dot. So I will talk to you guys next week, and thank you for the questions as always.